Christian Reiner spent much of his childhood in the university where his father worked and became increasingly drawn toward the arts. Emphasizing the influence of the museum trips he took as a young boy, Christian acknowledges the profound influence this exposure to the arts had during his formative years. He also narrates many interesting tales of his involvement in the world of photography and lithography, and of his studies with Ansel Adams, and of his adventures with fashion photography, shooting covers and fashion spreads for Vogue and Harper's magazines.
I grew up in a university. My dad was head of business administration, and the art professor was my best friend of all of them. Anyway, Professor Menning was his name. And when I was young, maybe 10, 12, he introduced me to clay, which was wonderful. I made a lion out of clay. I thought it was amazing. I was very happy. And soon after, when I was 12, 13, he invited me to come along for museum trips. Amsterdam, Paris, Rome. But the insight I got in terms of different cultures and their sense of history as embedded in paintings and sculpture was quite amazing. And so at the age of 13 and 14, I decided that art was it. I had my first show at 16, which was, well received. But I think from that point onwards, I made every decision that needed to be made in regards to the arts. And it always oscillated between photography and painting. Sculpture, I thought I'd leave for later, so I'm just about ready to start. I'm the kind of artist who is more a discoverer than anything else. Once I discover a technique and understand the technique, I move on. But my dad was a very insightful, wise person, so he made me do an apprenticeship as a lithographer. And his justification was something to fall back onto later in life, etc. So I did. And because of that, years later in the US, I just had to pick up a telephone and tell them I was trained in Germany and I had a job. I took the summer off after my apprenticeship and went to Ireland, worked on a farm, just to see what it was like. Mm-hmm. And when I came back, a really good photographer, Lothar Volley, said, "Hey, if you ever want to know, come by my studio. You're more than welcome." So I came to his studio as a second assistant. And it was very interesting because it took me into a whole different world. It was like one of those situations I described earlier where you establish a technique, and once you master it, you can move on. And I had done my apprentice period in photography. And I lived in London then, stayed there for 5 years, right until 1970. And I worked as a freelance photographer and illustrator and graphic designer and all that kind of stuff. And we did Private Eye magazine and all kinds of different publications. I lived in a big brownstone house in Mayfair, which, of all places, which is a very posh area. And there were maybe 35 of us living in the house. And we were an experimental society. It was very interesting. I did this for 14 years. But I photographed a lot of people. Who was there? Marianne Faithfull, Mick Jagger. Nice man. Very modest kind of guy. Very different personality than what you see on stage. Totally different. I've often, and this is again, this is the same paradigm. I wasn't aware of it. But like I said, if I finish a technique and I'm happy with it, I feel I've achieved what I wanted, then I move on. The same thing happens with me with cities. When I go somewhere and I figure out the collective psyche of a city, or at least I think I do, then I say, aha, and I move on. So from I lived in California, then I moved to Taos, New Mexico, because Ansel Adams had told me I should go there. Yeah. I visited him because he was kind of like family. My grandmother was a Stieglitz, and Ansel Adams, his mentor was Stieglitz, Alfred Stieglitz. I think art is not my priority. It's a form world, right? I'm now, and always have been, on a spiritual kind of path. And in my art, I try to convey the essence of things, so the spiritual nature of it, right? The manifestation of something really great. And there comes a point where the pursuit of art, or, you know, forming, being creative, becomes a little bit like a handicap. Because the primary internal experience is more powerful, and it doesn't lend itself in all its intricacies and in its timelines to the canvas or to any other form of art. And so, like this summer, I want to photograph. And the reason why is because it goes so quickly. There's so much saturation in the image psyche of the world that you can't really hold on to images any longer. I had several images when I was a young man that I treasured because they held something. They were like a safety deposit box for me. If I looked at them, I'd feel good, right? But I don't think that exists anymore. I think we're so amazingly saturated that the world of images has moved on. It has gone way past the canvas. It lives in cell phones of the next generation and the generation to come. But what I'm looking for in the landscape is not what I can bring to it, but what it is. So it's always, with photography, the great issue and problem has always been whether it's an authentic form of art. Of course it is. But it's totally subject-oriented. It is the subject that is the interesting part of the photograph, not the person behind the camera. You see, the wonderful thing about lake country is that it's neutral. It's totally neutral. It doesn't have an ambition as such, except to be here. I still find there are many mysteries, and now I don't have to necessarily physically try and explore them or discover through physical making things into forms. Yeah. So I can tackle things more directly without having to come into form. I don't want to make recommendations to a younger generation. It'd be foolish. I mean, it would assume then, you would assume then that I would know anything, right? I don't. I'm very proud of it.